Taking a Stand for Women's Rights by Anna Gorman. Although talks of women's rights were in the air as early as the 18th century, when Abigail Adams wrote to her husband encouraging him to remember the ladies, the first women's rights convention in the U.S. was not held until 1848. At this convention, women discussed the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of women. The convention was 2 days long, the first being exclusively for women and the second for the general public. During the first day, around 200 women, including revolutionary-thinking women such as Susan B. Anthony, discussed the Declaration of Sentiment and Grievances that was written by one of the convention leaders named Elizabeth Cady Stanton. This document was based on the Declaration of Independence, borrowing the phrase, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." This declaration was read to the general public on the second day of the convention. The women's efforts paid off for the first time in 1849 when the state of California granted women the right to own property. In 1850, the first National Women's Suffrage Convention was held in Worcester, Massachusetts. This convention was also held in 1851. Unfortunately, the movement was temporarily put on the back burner during the Civil War. After the war's end in 1869, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton created the National Women's Suffrage Association. The hope of this association was to eventually achieve the women's right to vote. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the first president, followed by Susan B. Anthony. This group of women helped put out propaganda, hopefully convincing Americans that women deserve the right to vote. Luckily, on December 10, 1869, the same year the association was formed, Wyoming became the first state to pass laws on women's suffrage. The American Women's Suffrage Association was also formed in 1869 and worked on amending state constitutions to allow women to vote. Susan B. Anthony was one of the most passionate suffragists, and she proved so when she cast a ballot in the presidential election of 1872. Unfortunately, Anthony was arrested along with 15 other women for voting illegally. Anthony was also refused a trial, which was very unfair. Many other women arrived at polling booths demanding a ballot, but were turned away or simply told no. From the beginning of the history of this country, women were treated like second-class citizens, says Sonia Fuentes, author and speaker whom I interviewed. They were not considered the equal of men in any sphere, intellectually and otherwise. They couldn't vote, they couldn't own property, their husbands were the responsible members of their family, they couldn't be executors of states, and on and on. Their sphere was by and large limited to the home, housekeeping, and raising children. This setback was not enough to make the passionate women suffragists give up. The first ever amendment to the U.S. Constitution giving women the right to vote was proposed in Congress in 1878. The amendment was not even voted on until 1887 when it lost in the House. In 1890, the National Women's Suffrage Association merged with the American Women's Suffrage Association to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Also in 1890, the American Federation of Labor showed support for the women's suffrage movement. This played a part in what's known as the Progressive Era, where women began to work more outside of the home. During this period, which lasted between 1890 and 1920, women also took a much more active role in politics. In 1895, the National American Women's Suffrage Association disassociates themselves from Elizabeth Cady Stanton after she published her book, The Woman's Bible. Despite being one of the founders of the movement, Stanton is seen as too radical by the association. Between 1893 and 1912, women in Colorado, Utah, Idaho, Washington, California, Oregon, Kansas, and Arizona were granted full voting rights. Like any movement, not everybody was thrilled with women's suffrage. During this time, there was an association called National Association opposed the women's suffrage, who released propaganda explaining why they believed women should not have the right to vote. In 1913, there was the Women's Suffrage Procession, a parade in which thousands of women suffragists walked all over Washington, D.C. before the inauguration of President Woodrow Wilson. This suffrage parade was organized by Alice Paul of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. During the parade, there were over 8,000 marchers and 20 floats. Unfortunately, many women were ridiculed or assaulted for standing up for their rights and marching. Although the policemen on duty that day seemed to sympathize with the suffragists, they made no effort to stop people from assaulting them. Although the policemen on duty that day seemed to sympathize with the suffragists, they made no effort to stop people from assaulting them. Because of the minimal efforts by the policemen to help protect the women, nearly 200 women were injured during the parade. In 1916, the women's suffrage movement grew stronger when Jeanette Reagan of Montana became the first ever woman to serve in Congress. She was able to work closely with Woodrow Wilson, and in 1918, Woodrow Wilson went to Congress and suggested the 19th Amendment. Congress finally passed the 19th Amendment, and it was sent to the states for ratification. And, finally, after decades of work and effort and taking a stand, the 19th Amendment was finally passed on August 26, 1920. Because of this, women could no longer be denied the right to vote solely because they were women. This passing of the amendment was a cause for celebration. This amendment was vital to our country's history. Because of this amendment, women are now allowed to vote and take an active role in politics just like their male counterparts. This is very important because in times like today, every vote in an election counts. It is extremely unfair that someone is denied the right to vote because of something they cannot control, such as gender. Finally, the 19th Amendment caused a great shift in how women were perceived. Not only did many women feel empowered to finally go and get jobs and educations, but also many people also started to see women as more like leaders, just as men were seen for many years.